Welcome everyone to the CMA Canada's webinar, Future Value Drivers. My name is Todd Scaletta. I am CMA Canada's Vice President for Research and Innovation. Before introducing our two speaker and panel member, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping aspects. Number one, below the video screen you'll see an area where you can download the CMA publications related to this webinar. In addition, if you do have a question that you'd like to submit during the webinar, press on the Submit a Question button, and we'll try to answer your questions during the webinar. If not, we'll have a frequently asked questions as part of the archived, and we'll address those questions at that point. As part of the registration process for this webinar, you answered a number of poll questions. We will be going over those poll questions during the webinar. And finally, as mentioned, we will be archiving this webinar on the CMA Canada Research website, www.managementaccounting.org. As well on that website there's numerous other CMA publications that will be of value to you. Our main speaker for this webinar is Barnard Marr. Barnard is a leading global authority and best-selling author on organizational performance and business success. In this capacity, he regularly advises leading companies, organizations, and governments around the globe, which make him an acclaimed and award-winning keynote speaker, researcher, consultant, and teacher. Barnard Marr is acknowledged by the CEO Journal as one of today's leading business brains. Barnard has written a number of seminal books and over 200 high-profile reports and articles on managing and measuring organizational performance, as well as enterprise business intelligence. This list of best-selling books include The Intelligent Company, Key Performance Indicators, More with Less, Managing and Delivering Performance, and Strategic Performance Management. Joining Barnard as a panel member is Jean Kempton, who is the Controller in the Department of Innovation and Advanced Learning for the province of Prince Edward Island. Jean has over 20 years of experience in both private and public sector. She brings extensive management, accounting, and strategic leadership to those roles. As the Controller, Jean acts as a senior representative of the department, providing advice and guidance in relation to financial and strategic matters, as well as is responsible for collaborating with federal and provincial counterparts to foster relations and develop efficiencies between and within government. Jean has her CMA designation as well as an MBA. She is currently Vice President of CMA PEI and has held various council positions over the past 7 years, as well as being a mentor to many CMA students. Jean also shares her knowledge and experience as a sessional accounting instructor at the University of Prince Edward Island School of Business, bringing practical experience to the classroom using an evidence-based approach. So welcome both Barnard and Jean, and at this point, Barnard, I'd like to turn the session over to you.
Very good. Thank you, Todd. What we want to talk about in this session is future value drivers. And when we talk about future value drivers, it's really the things that will enable a business or an organization to perform well in the future. And in particular, most of these value drivers today are intangible in nature. So what I want to outline is a 5-step framework that helps us to identify, measure, and manage our intangibles in our businesses. So we start really by identifying what are intangibles and how can we check whether we have any in our business and where are they. And once we've done this, we can then map them out to understand the role they're playing in our strategy. Then we need to design good indicators, because it's hard to manage something you can't really measure. So we need performance indicators. And then we need to make sure we manage those intangibles well, especially risks associated with intangibles, identifying possible gaps that we have, even looking at mergers and acquisitions and understanding missing intangibles or complementary intangibles in those. And finally, when organizations report on performance, intangibles play an increasing role in this, and we can discuss how we best do this. Okay? So, just to give a bit of context, I think organizations often struggle to understand why are intangibles important, and I guess we only need to look at some of the big companies at the moment, be it companies like Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Google, many others, where we know when we look at their actual physical and financial asset base and compare this with their overall valuation, we see a huge gap.
Right.
Where we say, actually, how can we justify that? And the value of these companies is obviously somewhere in those intangibles, be it a brand, being processes they have put in place, be it patents they own, intellectual property. Sometimes it might even be the leadership of these organizations. So we've seen this in a number of organizations. Top people leave, valuation goes down because the trust in the leadership team. So there are lots of intangibles, and it's worth exploring how they are important. And what I see is that lots of organizations, especially small and medium-sized organizations, often struggle to understand the role of intangibles in their business.
At this point, I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
When you think about the intangibles versus hard assets or tangibles, what about risk mitigation? Is it harder to deal with risk management within the intangible world than something tangible, as far as buying insurance and other aspects, versus reputational risk and how you might deal with that? So.
I don't think it's harder. We just need to be aware of where the risks are, and then we need to find ways of managing them. What I see a lot is when organizations talk about risk management, they look at the very traditional financial risk, they look at business continuity risks, but they don't really look at the risk of losing their reputation, the risk of losing some key individuals in their organizations, risk of patents running out. Sometimes in some of these they will, but they usually don't have a good feel of the cross sections of intangibles.
Okay, so the enterprise risk management system that you could have in place on the tangible side can just be moved over to be more encompassing to take in those intangibles.
Absolutely, it just needs to be expanded to take those into account.
Not a different tool or anything, existing tools,
Exactly.
wider broad
Absolutely.
mindset. Okay.
Same tool, wider application.
Okay.
So when we talk about intangibles, what they are really are the drivers of your performance. So it's like what you want is we very often talk about outcomes versus performance drivers. The focus very often in companies is we measure outcomes and have we delivered the financial performance today. If you really think about this, financial performance today is an outcome of having done the right things in the past. In the same way that future financial performance will depend on doing the right things today. So if you invest in the right brand image, if you invest in the right people, if you develop the right competencies, the right skills, you develop the right intellectual property, all of this will hopefully help you. So you basically seed plans that will hopefully reap financial benefits in the future. And this is really the context that is really vital to understand. And what I see in lots of organizations is that we only see part of this picture. We miss the intangible bit out quite often. So they look at outcomes and things they can easily measure. And for me, the analogy is a bit like if we look at the history of sailing and shipping. When they figured out how to navigate the oceans, the first thing they identified was the longitudes. So they had tools available to measure those, and therefore they could somehow navigate. But it was still, sometimes they want to discover America or India and they end up in America. So you couldn't quite know where you were. And one of my friends, Live Edmondson, talked about corporate longitude, so intangibles being this second dimension that you need to understand. And only once you have your intangibles and your financial outcomes, you can then really understand where you are on your journey. Does this make sense?
Yes. Yeah.
So I think we have a poll question before we go into more detail of what intangibles are. And we asked the audience
Sure.
a question.
Yeah, so the first poll question we have is, what percentage of your company's value is based on intangibles? And the responses were 75 to 100%, 50 to 74%, 25 to 49%, or under 25%. At this point, Jean, so what were some of your thoughts on the initial results that we're seeing from this poll?
Well, I think, first of all, I think you're very correct. These intangibles are inside our organizations, but we tend to focus more on the tangible side, what we can measure, and not putting a lot of value around them, let alone risk mitigation from them. But I wonder, in looking at the results that came in, where a lot, kind of felt that they didn't value them. Does that vary depending on the business or the organization, or even sectors for that matter, in regards to how they're valued?
Yes, and the proportion of intangibles will be different. They matter in every industry. Even if we look at very traditional manufacturing companies, where you think, okay, they have a lot of physical assets, they have a big company, machines in them that produce stuff. Even there, intangibles are important. They still need the knowledge to operate those machines. They have to have competencies of the right people, to have the right skills. They probably need a good brand image and good relationships with their partners to supply things. They need to have a good brand image so people buy from them. But if you then move to some of the internet businesses where they have very little physical assets, the proportion of intangibles is much higher. And in government organizations, again, physical assets are very few, actually. And if you look at modern government organizations, they very often rent their buildings. There's not much physical assets, and most of this is actually intangibles. And so even though proportion changes, what is important to understand is that those physical assets can be transferred very easily, so they don't really give you competitive advantage anymore. Right. So I remember the CEO of Coca-Cola saying that if our plant burned down today, I could go to the bank, borrow some money, and we'll be up and running in a few months again. So their value is based on a reputation, on their branding, and other things, on their formula and their secret. Yeah. So that's really important to understand, that the competitive advantages usually derive from your intangibles. Even though financial and physical assets are important, what will differentiate your company from your competitors are the intangibles.
So even if it is a smaller percentage based on the sector that you're operating
in,
it's going to be the distinguishing factor.
Absolutely, that's exactly what I'm saying.
And certainly as you go higher in certain sectors, like we talked about IT, and you gave a number of examples there that have large percentage of intangible, it's even more of a leverage or distinction for them.
Exactly.
Okay.
Well, I think of manufacturing, plants or that sort of sector or organization. And, you have someone, if someone's going to leave the organization, you have procedure manuals. This is how we do things. Mm-hmm. But when you come to the IT sector, it's so much about creativity and thinking and, not something that you can easily transfer from one person to another unless they actually have the same skill set.
Exactly, yes. Yeah. So let's look at the 5 steps of the framework. So we need to identify our intangibles first, and I will first explain what they are, and then give you a number of tools that we can use to identify them. Then we need to map them to understand how the intangibles drive our existing performance. Then we need to have indicators in place to manage them. Once we measure them, this allows us to manage them, and also to report on them. So let's start with the first element, identifying your intangibles. And the analogy I want to give you is comparing any organization to an apple tree. So if you compare your own organization now to an apple tree, what we want to understand first is, why have we got a tree? And we think, okay, I'm a government organization, I need to serve my community and deliver benefits. Or you might say I'm a commercial company, so I need to deliver return to my shareholders. So once you have the context for your tree, you know why you have it, you then need to understand what sort of apples do I need to grow. Is it red apples, green apples? So you need to understand your customer value proposition and what you're actually delivering to your customers. Then you look at the trunk of the tree and saying, okay, in order to do this now, what do we have to be really good at? What are the processes and the competencies we have to excel at that are core to delivering those apples? And though this trunk of the tree is partly some of your intangibles, your core competencies. But what we all know is that a tree would die if we don't take care of the roots. So very similar, when we look at a tree, we see the trunk of the tree, we see the foliage, the top, we see the apples, but there's something hidden from our view that is under the ground. And we all know that the root system is probably as big as what we can see above ground. And they're your intangibles that feed, and in companies it's the same, that you go into a company, you see the buildings, you see everything that's happening, but we all know that it's the stuff that's going on in people's heads, it's the brands, it's the intangibles that really drive performance, it's the organizational culture and lots of other elements. And so what we need to make sure is we nurture these roots and we understand which of these roots are important, so they will grow apples in the future and deliver the benefits to your stakeholders.
Yeah, the other analogy that I've heard is an iceberg, where you can see the top of is visible, yet underneath, a large portion of the value is not visible, and that's
Absolutely.
the intangible part.
Yeah.
So,
And the reason why I like the tree analogy is that it's this whole nurturing, the
Absolutely,
growing.
yeah.
So if you don't take care of the roots today, the tree in the long run will die or won't produce the fruits to level you would like to.
Right, and it still will be visible there for maybe 1 or 2 years, but eventually it will succumb.
Yes.
And so even if you stop to feed it initially, it doesn't necessarily die right away.
Exactly.
But you've put it in now position that it's on that
Exactly.
path.
So it gives you this idea of this cause and effect
Yes,
relationship, that these intangibles over the long term will drive future performance. So it's not an immediate impact, but over the long run it will be.
Yep.
So it's easy to cut costs now,
Exactly.
but it will have an impact somewhere along the line.
Yes.
The other reason why I like this is that it shows it. For me, there are two different ways of looking at strategy. One is you look at the market, you identify new opportunities for your company, and you say, okay, let's go for this. What lots of companies realized is that you can't actually do this very easily, because your skills and competencies have to shift. So you can't just be a car company one day and become an IT company the next. So actually what they learned is that lots of these intangibles and your skills are what they call path dependent. So whatever decision you made in the past have an effect on the future. They're growing, very similar to a tree that grows over time.
Right.
So maybe this analogy works better as an orchard, where you say, okay, I need some new competencies. People now want red apples instead of green apples, so I better plant some trees that grow red apples in the future.
Right.
So, but it will take time to grow these. And once the tree is there, it's very hard to just make it grow red apples instead of green. Right? Does this make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So
You're talking about kind of diversifying too then, are you? From not focusing just on one skill set or one competency, but actually, you know, in your analogy, you have the apples where you would have green ones and red ones, so you're diversifying
yes,
what you have
Yeah.
internally.
exactly.
Does that also position yourself to be more agile as well as an organization?
Yes, at the same time understanding the competency you actually need
Yes, exactly.
and focusing on those.
Yeah.
So there are two different strategy approaches. One is saying there's a new opportunity, let's reshape our company to deliver this.
Right.
Another one is actually let's look at our orchard and what we have and how we best leverage this. So maybe we can, instead of just producing apples, we can produce cider as well. So companies look at their existing asset base and their intangibles and what are their core competencies and trying to leverage those.
Right. And reacting to the market.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So hopefully this gives you an idea of what the role of intangibles. Now let's define a little bit what we actually mean by intangibles, because people often struggle to understand, okay, I've got a building, I've got this, and I've got that, so what are these intangibles that might be part of the value of my business? And they're usually split into three different segments. So the first one is what they call human capital or human resources. So anything related to us as human beings. So it is our skills, competencies, our education levels, our qualifications, as well as our engagement level, our motivation. So anything related to us as people. The difficulty with this category is that you don't own them as a business. So
Right.
these people can walk out any day they want, and even if they can't walk out because they have another year of a contract to go, they can decide to switch on and switch off and not
Right.
contribute. So that is a very hard category to control and to risk manage. The second category is then your relational capital. So this basically refers to any relationships you have as a company, be it with your customers in terms of a brand, in terms of customer loyalty, as well as with your suppliers, your partners, your distributors, your banks, your shareholders, so any partnership you have. And they can be informal partnerships, or they can be formal partnership like joint ventures and others. And the third category is your organizational capital. So they are things that they really belong to the business. So on the vaguest sense is the organizational culture, because if one person leaves, unless it's a very influential chief executive, usually the culture doesn't change. So the way you do things, the way the company operates, then you have something around their operational processes, the way the organization is structured. They are intangibles. And finally, most well-defined intangibles are your intellectual property. So do I have any patents, any rights, any licenses? And if you look at all these three categories, what we want to understand is, do they matter in my organization, and to what extent do they matter? So I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that you say we need to have a tick box exercise saying we've got this human capital, we've got these relational capital, and then map this out like that. What you want to understand is, what are the intangibles that drive my business? And it's useful sometimes to have a framework to think about. There's an overlap between them, so they are not clearly defined, and there's no need for that. In the past, what happened is that there was a big movement saying we need to move some of the human capital, which is very loose, which can work out any day, and turn this into organizational capital. So if I can take the knowledge you have in your head, because I know you're very valuable, or you could go any minute, if I can take this and put this into a manual, that would be really useful. So if I could codify it, so it's mine. And then after a while, I think companies realize it's not that easy, because there's a difference between what is in your head, which is more tacit, and making this explicit is actually impossible, or very rarely possible. But there's still this movement, companies trying to say, I want all my intangibles belong to me and have them protected.
When you talk about the human capital side, is it more, when you say that it's very hard to control that aspect, right, because people can walk out the door, is it more about understanding the skill that you need in that position? So
when I say it's hard to control, I don't think it is actually. What we need to do is we need to put processes in place to manage this. So if you value your staff, then you need to create an environment where they like to work in. So therefore, you can't chain them to your company, but you can create an environment where they want to love and work in the business. But you're absolutely right. What we want to do is you want to identify the skills and competencies you need to grow your apples. So there are certain sets of skills to grow green apples, other skills to grow red apples. You need to make sure you have the right competencies in place.
Plus motivate them and hopefully encourage them that this is where they want to work, this is where they want to stay.
So there's a huge, I think this whole competition for talent is coming back. Global war for talent, where they realize actually if we want top talent, we need to find the right people that want to work for our company. And so one of the big intangibles is to have a desirable employment brand. High-flying people with strong competencies wanting to work for your business. So they are the categories, and this is a very good starting point. But then when we look at intangibles, what is important to understand is that on their own, they're actually not valuable. Because if I have a great reputation, that's great, but if I don't have the processes to deliver against my customer expectations, then my brand image disappears very quickly. So there's therefore a connection between those. So I can't, if I wanted to say how valuable are my individual intangibles, I don't think this is possible. What you need to do is you need to look at the whole set so that they're all interlinked. They all depend on each other. So they're dynamic, and if you take one away, it will affect everything else. So if you take the brand away from Amazon, you will have a big problem. At the same time, if you take some of the leadership, if you take some of the processes, if you take the patent of the one-click buying process away, all of this will affect their brand and their reputation and everything else.
It's all interconnected.
It is all interconnected, absolutely. So we have intangibles are important drivers for future performance. When we want to look at intangibles, it's useful to look at these three categories, but at the same time understanding that they're not individual, they're all interconnected. So this is a little bit of background. And when organizations want to identify those intangibles, it's useful to go through a process by which they say, okay, these are the strategic objectives I want to achieve in the future. These are the apples I want to grow. Now let's look at the framework of intangibles. Which of these are really important for me? And then you can say, how do they interlink? How do they interdepend?
Yeah.
Once you've done this, you can then map them. And mapping them, what you want to do is you want to create this tree picture, and you want to basically overlay this with your strategic objectives. So this is just an example, and don't worry about reading this. It's just an illustration of how one company, a courier company, produced their strategy on a single page, saying these are the apples, this is what we want to produce, their financial deliverables, their customer deliverables, then the process they have to be really good at, so their trunk, and the learning and growth, these intangibles that are the roots of the business. And they call it here about people, but it's really about people, relationships, and culture and organizational resources. And you want to understand which of these are really important to drive your outcomes.
All the enablers that you need.
Exactly. And these things are called strategy maps. There are lots of variations of this. What I see a lot is when these strategy maps are designed is that organizations spend the least effort on the bottom perspective, on the what they call the learning and growth perspective that should contain your intangibles. But it's a bit like just trying to grow apples without ever taking care of the roots. So these are actually the important elements that will make sure that you're successful in the future. So if you're concerned about long-term performance, you need to make sure that they are taken care of and being managed. And actually, they are the most important ones. Even though they're at the bottom of the diagram, they are the roots that will nurture future performance.
Well, you're right. When you think about strategy, automatically you go to the tangible side, right? But without what you're talking about, without taking care of and managing the risk around the intangibles, you actually could end up with nothing.
Absolutely. So, again, the point I'm making, this is the generic strategy map template. And I know that there's another MAG, Management Accounting Guideline, available on how to produce strategy maps. So I don't want to go into this in too much detail. The point I want to make here is that these maps are unique to every business. So I have designed these kind of maps for a number of large banks, for example. They might look very similar at the top, where they say we want to have comparative shareholder returns. But the further you go down into the map, the more unique they become, because they have unique customer value propositions. They have definitely unique process challenges and definitely unique challenges around their intangibles and their people and branding issues. So this is really important, that there's no template for this. You have to design a unique map for your organization. And once you have this, you can then start testing and understanding the importance of how the different intangibles actually lead to the next layer up and deliver future performance. So we ask a few questions around strategy maps.
Right, yes. And as Barnard mentioned there, CMA Canada does have some publications on strategy mapping that are available on our research website. Poll question number 2, does your company use strategy maps to visualize and communicate your organization's strategy? And if the answer is yes to the above, does the strategy maps link intangible drivers to performance? So, Jean, what were some of your initial thoughts on the results?
Well, I was actually quite surprised at the high number that do not, use the strategy maps to within their company, let alone the link that needs to be created back to the tangible piece. So, when you talk about the three categories that you gave, talking about your human capital and your relationships, I mean, those are critical in a lot of businesses. And yet it seems like the majority of the companies, or, you know, even in our own organizations, I'm not so sure that we value those things as much as we should.
And it's all about making it explicit and being able to communicate then to everyone that these things are important and are drivers of the future. And this very much reflects the view I see across the world, really, in organizations, that still the majority don't map their strategy. They might have something like scorecards and balanced scorecards, but they don't have the strategy maps. And for me, they are the key tool to enable the management of future value drivers. And again, you would expect everyone who has a strategy map to then have a clear link of their intangibles, and what we can see is that they don't.
Right.
That quite a few haven't made the clear links. And again, like with any template, the danger is if you give someone a template, it's very easy to just populate the template as opposed to really think about your strategy and making it yours and identifying the things that actually will drive your business performance going forward.
In your experience, is it basically the same across the world? Like, is it different in any countries where there's a stronger focus to do that? Or is it pretty much that no one does it really well?
No, I wouldn't say no one does it very well. I think there's North America is quite good. I think around Northern Europe is not bad. I think Asia, there's a huge interest in this that's starting to happen. What is interesting is that I see difference in between public and private a little bit. In the public sector, they almost see this as a tick box exercise. They have to produce something like a strategy map, so they produce one, and it's not necessarily a reflection of their strategy. For lots of different reasons this is. I mean, if I was a leader of a political organization, it makes my life a lot easier if I have a very fuzzy strategy that no one really understands, because I can take it to all my different stakeholders who all try to pull me into different directions, then say, and this is what I do for you, it's on page 8, and then you go to the next, and this is what I do. So there's a real challenge for government organizations to actually be very explicit. However, I think Barbados as a country, they have created a strategy map for government and for the country, which is very interesting. I've just been tweeting about this because I thought it's really interesting to find a country strategy map, and they've been brave enough to do it. But they're obviously smaller
Right.
and less complex than most other government
But
organizations.
still to be explicit and to visualize that is an important aspect.
Absolutely, and I always say makes it easy at the top for the man or woman at the top, but then the further you go into the organization, people are lost because they don't understand the priorities.
Well, and you're so correct. In the public sector, they're out to please as many as they possibly can, and you can't please everybody so when you lay your strategy on the table and you say, this is the way I'm going, not everybody might agree with you.
Yeah.
So I can see the reluctance there from the public sector to certainly bring that forward.
Yeah. Very good. So once we have now identified our intangibles, we now understand what they are, we have mapped them into a strategy map or something similar, we now need to measure those. And when it comes to intangibles, there's a general perception that intangibles are difficult to measure. And what we need to understand is that they're not really. They're just different methods of collecting the data. So instead of just counting things, we might want to do a survey. We might want to have a focus group where we ask people questions. We might want to even do social media analysis to see what people are saying and the sentiment of what they're saying. So there are lots of other tools that we can use to collect data on those intangibles. For me, an important point that I always stress here is that data on those intangibles often relies on our perception. And we have to start trusting people's judgment a bit more. So if you think about this in your organization, most people can probably give you a very good idea of what the perception is and what the relationships are with your partners and suppliers, for example. I always remember one company who moved from a strategy where they were the big company and they tried to squeeze their suppliers to a minimum to one that then shifted into actually some of our suppliers went bankrupt and this had a big impact on our supply chain, so we better foster really good relationships with them, create win-win partnerships. So this was now an objective, and they realized that putting this in place would help them to perform better in the future. So this is now, they've identified this intangible, they've mapped it onto their strategy. Now they need indicators for this. And how do they do this? How can they collect meaningful data? And what happened is that the executive team said, we need indicators, we need measures to control this, otherwise we are lost, otherwise you're in the boat in the middle of the ocean without your navigation. So what this team did is they searched for companies, they typed into Google measuring relationships, and they found a company that specialized in this, a survey company, and this survey company had a ready-made survey. And they said, this is brilliant. And not only this, we can then compare ourselves with all the other companies.
Benchmarking, yeah.
So they've now been doing this for 3 years. However, when I walked into this company, I was very suspicious when I looked at what they were collecting. So I asked them, so how useful is the data? And said, it's all very good. They showed me their reporting. I then spoke to some of their suppliers who told me a very different story, saying that this company is very important to us, but we get really annoyed with them because
All the survey.
because 2 times a year they sent me this 6-page long survey. I have no idea how any of this links to what we do with them, and it takes me 3 days to collect all of this data. So we then went back and said, okay, just take me through how you used this information. And what came out is that over the last 3 years, not one decision was ever taken based on this seemingly interesting data. So they then went back to basics and said, how can we, what we're really interested in is the relationship improving. And a good way forward would be to ask people in their own business. So they have account managers who work with the supplier every day. So they introduce a tool saying, how good is the relationship? A simple email tool that is now emailed once a month to their account managers, who then tick a little box saying from good to bad. This data is then stored in a database. The same email is sent to their suppliers. So instead of getting a 6-page long survey, they now get one single question, which they tick. The database compares the 2 numbers. If there's a difference, it triggers a little internal email saying, you picked 8, they picked 5, there's obviously a difference in opinion.
Right.
Can you please pick up the phone and speak to them?
Yeah.
And for me, this is a perfect example of actually finding ways of measuring and capturing those intangibles. And what we are often hung up on is turning this into objective numbers. But what we really want is we want measures that help us to better manage this.
Right.
So,
That seemed like a good system too, because I was thinking you can have the account manager maybe putting a higher value on from just trying to give the best results and good results all the time. But by going back to the supplier as well, you got that check aspect to offset. In some cases, they may be more pessimistic, not likely, but in other cases, they may be more pessimistic.
Yes.
So it's good to do that and say, okay, we'll pick up the phone, let's get some more contact with them and find out what's going on.
absolutely. And I think looking at what they call qualitative research tools.
Right.
So instead of quantitative, which usually just do a big survey, focus on big numbers, we look at more qualitative things where you do observation, where you think how things are working, where you trust people's judgments a bit more, where you actively seek their feedback. And all of this will help us to understand our intangibles much better. So my advice on anyone who wants to measure their intangibles is first really understand what intangibles do I want to measure and what do I want to know. Once you've established this, you then go out and say, okay, have I already got some information in my business that will help me? If not, then you just have a quick look on Google, and if you want to be a bit more adventurous, on Google Scholar. Because if you think about this, Google Scholar is basically the academic search engine of Google. And what this allows you to do is to just see what research has been done. And if you think about this, anyone who has ever done any management research has come up with tools. So everyone in HR,
Right.
they've all designed models, and if they've done their PhD, they spend 3 years of their life studying everything else out there. So this is usually a very good starting point. So there are lots of tools out there to measure anything you can think of. be it organizational culture, being leadership performance, being brand performance, and so on. Just by looking at those tools, that's a very good starting point, and then you can customize them to your own needs.
Well, now, I would think that would be key, is the customization, because, I mean, these tools would be, developed very generically, as opposed to looking internal to the specifics of the organization, would they?
And sometimes it's useful to have generic tools, because they allow you then to, again, compare results. So if you have lots of companies using similar tools, you can then benchmark your results. Okay. Once we have started to measure and we get some insight into this, the next step is then to actually manage our intangibles. And the management, for me, there are two areas I want to emphasize. One is that we need to understand the impact of our intangibles and understand that not all intangibles are equally important. Right. So you can start to test what is the cause and effect link between those and which are the most important ones. And you can then understand some of your weaknesses in your existing strategy. You can look at existing resource allocations. So for example, if you have 5 intangibles you've identified, you can then measure performance against them. You can see some of them are performing poorly, some of them are performing very well. If you then look at the strength and how important they are in impacting future performance, you can then see a link here. And what you want is you want those that are very important, they need to perform especially well. And this is where you then need to add resources to manage those. Mm-hmm. So it's about understanding your strategic management, understanding your resources and where you put your efforts and against the performance they are delivering at the moment. The second one is risk management, that we have to understand the risks associated with those intangibles, and we talked about this already. Right. So basically what we want to do is we want to take our existing risk management framework and just extend this to all our intangibles. So if you identified 10 key intangible value drivers in your strategy map, then in addition to having indicators that measure how well you're performing, you want risk indicators, or you want risk management tools that allow you to understand what is the impact of key people leaving, what is the impact on my reputation going down, and how do I mitigate those risks.
Yeah, it's neat how that's the piece when you make a comment like that it really connects it back to what you have in an organization for tangibles. Because really without that piece, again,
exactly.
You don't have very much if you don't take that into account.
We have a poll question here.
Yes, this is our last poll question for the webinar. Does your organization regularly assess the risks associated with your intangibles? And so, Jean, what are some of your thoughts on the results here?
From a perspective of our own organization inside government, I'd say we certainly don't assess it as often as we should. And inside an organization like governments, you're right. The human capital, the people who are driving the agendas, are pretty key to the organizations. And in Prince Edward Island in particular, we have an aging population, and we have a large number of senior people who will be leaving the organization within the next 5 years. And, this is a huge risk from an information perspective of what's going on, the history that's been there. So I think that, certainly we don't do it often enough. And I think that the risks are extremely high of not doing that kind of risk analysis.
And what are your observations, and what have you seen?
I see a similar picture that most companies don't do this very well. That risks are usually the very traditional, what happens if my building burns down, what happens if we get flooded, what happens if we run out of money, but they don't look at what happens if we lose our reputation, what are the risks associated with this, how can we start to manage them, mitigate them, what are the risks of someone stealing our intellectual property. And it's really important that we start looking at them, especially considering that they are the drivers of your future performance.
Right.
So they are the things you really want to manage your risks on.
Yeah, for sure.
the other aspect of managing your intangibles is it allows you to strategically develop your intangibles. So this can have different formats. So if you say, and we talked about this when people move from red apples to green apples, if you understand these trends, you need to start planting trees that grow those apples. So it's about internally making sure you have the right set of intangibles to drive your future performance. But it's also identifying, are there any bits of my strategy jigsaw that are missing? So when I design strategic maps and strategies for organizations, when we often go down to the intangibles, we realize that there are certain bits missing. That they realize, actually, we could do a lot better if we had those skills, if we were better at doing something in particular, if our reputation awareness would be better in this market segment and so on. So once you understand this, you can then, again, put resources in place to fill those gaps. But the other one is about, and you have different choices. You can then say, either I invest and build these resources myself, or you can bring them in from somewhere else. Yeah. And this is where it very quickly brings us into mergers and acquisitions. So sometimes it means just bringing individual people in, but sometimes it means bringing organizations in, bringing whole departments with certain skills and competency into the business, or aligning them with your own business. So what I have started doing quite a lot is helping organizations when they're starting to think about buying other companies to understand the infrastructure of their intangibles. Because what you're buying in most organizations, if you look at their book value and compare that to their market value, there's a big gap. So you're paying a lot of money for something, right, and they're usually the intangibles. Mm-hmm. And what you need to make sure is that they actually match. And I've had this in one organization in particular, a pharmaceutical company, where they seem to be a really good match in terms of their markets and what they were doing. When we then mapped each of those strategy maps out for each of the two organizations and looked at, we realized that there was very little complementarity, that they actually didn't match, and then they decided not to go ahead with the merger. And for me, this is a typical example where lots of mergers go wrong, because we know it's about leadership, it's about organizational culture, it's about processes, it's about lots of things that we can't necessarily understand very easily. So it's really important to delve into this level of detail to understand the structure of intangibles when you look at mergers.
It's an interesting exercise.
The final point then is reporting on intangibles. And why is this important? I think it's about communicating the importance of your intangibles to the different stakeholders. If you think about future employees that you want to attract, talking about the intangibles that matter to you and the importance of employees helps. Communicating the importance of branding and everything else, again, helps with partners, helps with finances as well. If you can clearly articulate your future value drivers and how you're managing them, that helps attract finance as well. So there are lots of reasons why we want to do this, and part of the problem why analysts very often get valuations of companies with a high proportion of intangibles wrong is because they haven't got those reports. They don't actually understand the structure of their intangibles, and it's not something you can just look up somewhere.
Right.
So there's a big incentive for companies to produce reports, and what we have seen in particular in Europe is that there was a big movement a few years ago of companies being encouraged by the European Union, by individual country governments to produce intellectual capital statements. I have seen this pretty much go away, right, because we talked about this earlier. It's a bit like adding an additional burden on the already big reporting infrastructure, right, that is there. So, however, what I see is that some of this thinking of reporting on intangibles is now going into our annual reports, where organizations create pictures of their strategy maps, where they outline the intangibles and how they're important, and they add this to their traditional financial information to make it richer. Right. And I think this is a really important step too. for most of organizations to think
Well,
about.
and, I mean, certainly it's interesting when you talk about mergers, because just thinking about it from a cultural perspective, right? If you're not looking at the two cultures of an organization and you put the two of them together, you can end up with a disaster pretty fast, right? Where you can't bring those two cultures together. So, certainly it highlights the value of looking at those intangibles and really understanding what you have, understanding what your partners have in regards to that too.
And for this last step, Barnard, where you talk about reporting, and you've shown and said, here's a couple examples of some external reporting, and there's been encouragement, which is now falling off a little bit. Reporting can also be internal. And so you might not go outside and say, here's our intellectual capital report, but internal, you're needing these requirements. And could you see this happening like from succession planning, that an organization might be able to take all this information and be able to get a better idea of talent management issues, succession planning issues as far as understanding that, but it's internal reporting.
Yeah, completely. And for me, the internal reporting is about measuring performance and then making this available.
Yes.
And absolutely.
For decision making.
Yeah, exactly. And that's another great Mac there.
Yeah, that's right.
I've worked with a company who's done this really well. They basically looked at their strategy. They then said, what are the most important skills and competencies I need for the next 10 years or so? They mapped them out. And then they didn't come up with something really complicated. They went back into the business and said, in terms of these skills, how good are you at the moment and where? And then they created different levels of organization, saying, I'm just starting to develop those skills, I'm in the middle somewhere, and I'm an expert. So they mapped those skills against the different competency profiles, and then they mapped the competency profiles against age profiles. And what they very quickly found out is that lots of people that were experts were highly competent, but they were also quite old.
Right.
So they're just about to leave. And for their most important competencies, I think they realized that 80% of the people would leave within the next 3 years. They then looked at how long does it actually take to develop those skills. It takes 3 years. What was interesting is when they initially, what they realized is if you bring in new people into those teams to pick up those skills over time, it actually decreases their productivity, because the expert then has to spend a lot more time coaching, training the young people, and they didn't quite like that. They said, I'm much more effective, just get rid of all these people that I need to train, I just do my job.
Right.
But from a company perspective, it's really dangerous. So they now monitor those competency levels against the age profile and make sure that they bring in new people early enough to make sure these skills get transferred, so they always have a balance of the skill mix and the age mix.
Interesting.
So let's summarize some of the key points. What we need to do is we need to identify those intangibles, and what I hopefully given you is a useful framework to think this through, where we look at our human, our relational, and our structural capital. So, okay, which of these really matter? Once we've done this, we then need to map them, and I've given you the tree analogy, where I emphasize it's really important that all these intangibles and the structure of them and how they interact and deliver future value is unique to every business. So we need to map this out. Once we've done this, we can then measure performance, and there are lots of tools out there. In the management accounting guideline we've produced, we outline a range of those tools in a lot more detail. We then need to make sure we manage those, and especially using this to test the importance of these value drivers over time, and then using this to manage your risks, I think internally is really critical. Unless you talk about mergers and acquisitions, when it becomes, again, really important. And finally, we need to start communicating the importance of these intangibles, and you rightly highlighted both internally and externally, and then this is really important, and it's important, and we encourage organizations to do this. And you're right, probably internally is more important than externally.
Terrific. We probably have time for one question from the audience. And the question we received is, for the 5-step process you outlined, what's the typical cycle time? And so, for instance, is this done on a monthly, quarterly, or annually basis, or does it vary depending on the organization or the circumstances? And I know you did mention about, a point in time event such as a merger, you might go through this cycle, but what have you typically seen for organizations that have been following this 5-step process?
That's a good question. And I would envisage that for most organizations, an annual cycle works. What you want to do is you want to align this somehow to your planning cycle.
Right.
So if you review strategy once a year, which for most organizations is okay, then this probably makes sense to design and to reevaluate your intangible structure at the same time. However, if something happens, like a merger and acquisition situation, if the market changes, then it's obviously useful to do this at this point again. So whenever there's a big change somewhere going on.
Okay.
Or if you work in a very fast-moving environment, like some of the internet companies I work with, they do this every 6 months, sometimes even every 3 months.
Right.
Yeah, back to your point on the market value, I would think that the economic conditions that this company was working inside would have an impact on how often they would do it as well.
Absolutely.
On behalf of CMA, I'd like to thank Barnard and Jean for joining us today and on this session. For our viewers, sorry if we didn't get to your questions. We will have a frequently asked questions part of our archived webinar, and you can go see that archived webinar on our CMA Canada research website, www.managementaccounting.org. Thank you.